Hey, Rocky Fork, thank you for joining us today. We hope that you will stay connected by downloading our app.
Well, good morning. It's good to be with you this morning. Technology, isn't it great? I'm really glad to be with you. And I see some of you who are wearing your NFL gear. It is opening weekend. So I wish all of you and your teams the best of luck. But I will only be praying for one team. That is my team. So, just so you're aware, my prayers might be powerful and effective in this area. So you might be wondering what this is. This is my fantasy football championship ring from last season. So, yeah. So there are about 10 of us who are in a league here. And yeah, I'll be praying for you guys. I'm not praying for your teams, but I'll pray for you guys. So week one of the NFL season, and that's good. But we are in week two of our series in Mark called Him. And remember, last week we talked about the purpose of the book of Mark. What is Mark all about? Mark is all about proclaiming who Jesus is to anyone who would read it. Proclaiming who Jesus is. He is the Messiah. He is the Son of God. And so Mark starts off by calling witnesses. And the first few verses of Mark, he calls on three different sets of witnesses. The first is Old Testament prophets. He calls on Isaiah, and he calls on Malachi. And they talk about the coming Messiah. And they say there's going to be a messenger who comes before the Messiah, who clears the path for him, who paves the way for him. That messenger is John the Baptist. John the Baptizer is the messenger that is sent ahead of Jesus, right? So the first two witnesses are Old Testament prophets and the messenger that they said would come. That's pretty compelling evidence, right? Well, there's one more witness. And that one more witness is God himself. Jesus is baptized, and God opens up the sky, looks down, and says, "This is my Son." So in the first few verses of Mark, what we see is witnesses it's compelling evidence of who Jesus is. That's the way Mark starts his gospel. And then we get to see Jesus start his ministry. And so Jesus is baptized, he is driven into the wilderness, and when he comes out, he begins to preach. And the first thing he preaches, Mark 1:15, he says, "The time has come. The moment is here. The kingdom is near. Repent and believe the good news." That's what he says. And so he's preaching this gospel message to anyone who would hear it. And then he takes that message and he goes and he finds some people to follow him. And he starts with Peter, Andrew, James, and John. They're his first disciples. He says, "Follow me," and they drop their nets and they follow him. They let everything go and they follow him. It's amazing that they drop all that they have. They drop their livelihoods to follow Jesus. Now, they're going to walk this path, and they're going to be part of this core group that Jesus builds for the purpose of building his church. And that's what they're going to do eventually. But we got a long ways to go before we get to that place. So we're going to get back into the book of Mark this morning. Before we do, I want to say just a little bit about Bible translations. And I know this is kind of, it's kind of boring talk. But here's the deal. I typically preach from the NIV, and the NIV is really readable. It is the most commonly used translation of the Bible. There are lots of good translations out there. And the NIV is usually the one I use to preach from. But when I study, I study from the NASB. And so since this is a study of the book of Mark, I thought, well, why wouldn't I preach from that? So I'm going to preach from the NASB. As any message that I'm doing, I'm going to preach from the NASB, and I just want you to know that. So if you're reading along and you're like, wait a minute, this doesn't look the same as, yeah, it's because I'm using a different version, okay? Now, you've heard me say this before. What is the best translation of the Bible? The one you pick up and read, right? So whatever you're going to read, that's what you need to be in. And my hope is that above all things in this series is that you will be encouraged to be in the Word, that you'll be reading the book of Mark, that you'll be following along with us and studying Scripture. So I hope that is one of the things that comes out of this series. All right, back to the book of Mark. So Mark chapter 1. Peter, Andrew, James, and John have decided to follow Jesus. Let's see where Jesus leads them. Mark 1, starting in verse 21, says this: They went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and began to teach. They were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. Just then there was a man in their synagogue with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, saying, What business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. And Jesus rebuked him, saying, Be quiet and come out of him. Throwing him into convulsions, the unclean spirit cried out with a loud voice and came out of him. They were all amazed, so that they debated among themselves, saying, What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. Immediately, the news about him spread everywhere into the surrounding district of Galilee. All right. So you remember last week we talked about Mark being a book of action. It is a book of action. So this passage is a great example. There's a word that Mark uses in there twice. Did you catch it? Immediately. Immediately. He uses the word immediately. Now, Mark loves that word. He uses it 41 times. He uses it way more than any other gospel writer. And it's almost as if Mark is stressing this sense of urgency to respond to the call of Jesus. Mark says, you've got to hear this message, and you've got to respond to it. There's an urgency to what Mark writes. There is no loitering in the book of Mark. There is no lingering in the book of Mark. Moving on. He's moving on. So let's talk about what happened here. Let's talk about the events in the synagogue. Jesus is in the hometown of his new fishers of men. And he's in this town called Capernaum. And he has established a pattern. He's established this predictable thing that he does. From the very first Sabbath he arrives in Capernaum, he has this pattern. On the Sabbath, he goes to the synagogue and he teaches. He goes to the synagogue and he teaches. And so he doesn't just teach. He's not just another teacher. He teaches with authority. He teaches with authority. And that's the way that people respond to it, right? His teaching is received by people as authoritative. Now, I always read this and thought, well, of course, Jesus is the Messiah. If he says something, people are going to listen. But there's more to it than that. This, typically, scribes would teach in the synagogue, and the way they would cultivate their authority, the way they would lend credibility to their words, is by citing other scribes. A long list of other people who would say the same things that they would. Like, this guy said, and this guy said, and this guy said, and this guy said, and because they all said it and I'm saying it, you should believe me. Jesus doesn't have to refer to other scribes. Jesus just teaches with authority. He simply speaks the truth. He simply speaks Scripture. He says the truth, and people hear it as spoken with authority. He doesn't say, they say this. Jesus says, I say this. And people see that, and they're like, wow, this is different. This is new. This is a guy who teaches with authority. But Jesus doesn't just teach with authority, he also acts with authority. He also acts with authority. The demon-possessed man, right? The man is just a shell. He is consumed by the demon. And so it's the demon that speaks. The demon speaks to Jesus, and he says, hey, what do you have to do with me, Jesus? Or did you come here to kill me, Jesus? And then he says something really interesting. He says, I know who you are. The demon says to Jesus, I know who you are. Let me tie this to another scripture that I'm sure you've heard before. James 2:19. James says, you believe that God is one? You do well. Even the demons believe. Even the demons believe and shudder, right? Jesus is seen by the demons for who he is. They see Jesus and they instantly know his authority. And they instantly know his power over them. And they instantly know that it is infinitely greater than theirs. It is greater than theirs. And he then shows them. And he shows them by commanding them. He says, come out of that man. I command you to come out of that man. And they come out of the man. He commands the demon to be quiet. Don't tell anybody else who I am. Jesus shows his authority to the demon, although the demon already knows and is afraid. Is afraid. But Jesus demonstrates his authority. He teaches with authority and he acts with authority. And we see that happen in the synagogue. So the people are amazed at his authority, the authority of his teaching, the authority of his actions. And here's what I want to stress. It is the consistency of his actions and his words that is amazing. The integrity of his actions and his words. They are aligned perfectly. There is no difference between what Jesus teaches and what Jesus does. And that is amazing. That's what people see as amazing. So, that whole event in the synagogue is amazing. How do you follow that up? Well, what do you typically do after church? You go eat. Yeah? You go eat. I mean, I can't say for certain that that's the reason they go to Peter's house, but it seems perfectly logical to me that that's what they would do. They go to Peter's house to eat. So let's read about what happens next. Mark chapter 1, starting in verse 29. It says this, and immediately after they came out of the synagogue, they came into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now, Simon's mother-in-law was lying sick with a fever, and immediately they spoke to Jesus about her. And he came to her and raised her up, taking her by the hand, and the fever left her. And she waited on them. She served them. When evening came, after the sun had set, they began bringing to him all who were ill and those who were demon-possessed. And the whole city had gathered at the door. And he healed many who were ill with various diseases and cast out many demons. And he was not permitting the demons to speak because they knew who he was. Now, I'm trying to picture Jesus leaving the synagogue with the boys, and I wonder if it's like when I leave church with my family. Hey, where do you want to eat? I don't care. Where do you want to eat? Anything sound good to you? Nah, not really. How about sushi? Gross. Oh, so you do care. I mean, I know that conversation happens like clockwork. And I think, man, I wish I could handle that situation like Jesus. I'm sure Jesus would have handled that conversation perfectly. In fact, we see it here because they walked out of the synagogue and immediately they go to Peter's. Hey, where do you want to eat, Peter's? That's where we're going. There's no doubt, right? So Jesus handles everything perfectly. I don't do anything immediately after church. I don't do anything immediately. But they go off to Peter's house. And Mark describes the situation when they get there as this. Peter's mother-in-law is sick with a fever. All right, that could mean any number of things. Luke, who is a doctor, right, the physician Luke, describes this event differently. He says that she had a great fever. So she is very, very ill. And Jesus heals her. The first thing they do, though, is Peter sees, hey, mom-in-law, I guess. Mom is sick. What do? First thing, go to Jesus. Why do they go to Jesus first? Because they've seen him work. They've seen him work. They know what he's capable of. And so they go straight to Jesus. And Jesus takes her by the hand and he heals her. Now, this is what I want you to see. He doesn't Tylenol away the symptoms, right? He doesn't take away the fever and that's it. Jesus cures her. I don't know, have any of you had a great fever? Like, I had malaria, 106-degree fever. That was terrible. When my fever broke, I did not want to serve anyone, right? I was not interested. I was done, tired, because my body had been all hands on deck fighting this infection. Jesus says, I'm going to heal you, but he's not going to heal the fever. He's going to heal completely. He's going to take care of whatever infection has caused that fever. He's going to take care of the depletion of strength in Peter's mother-in-law, and she's going to get up renewed immediately. Immediately. Completely and instantly healed. So much so that she serves them right away. That's powerful. When you think about that, and again, if you've ever had a fever like that, you know. I mean, even a light fever, when you're done, it's like, whew, I am wiped out, man. Not so when Jesus heals. Right. Word gets around. Word gets around. What happened at the synagogue, what happened at Peter's house, and people start coming. They start coming. They begin flocking to Jesus. And there's some really significant things that happen here in this passage. The first thing is this. Mark makes a clear distinction between demons and illness. There's a distinction between demons and illness. There are many people who say or who believe that demons cause all illness. The distinction between demons and illness that Mark makes tells us that demons do not cause all illness. Illness is an effect of our fallen world. It is part of the consequence of sin, right? There's illness, and I'm not saying that there aren't demon-caused illnesses. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying they don't cause all illness. And here's the other thing that comes out of that. Jesus has power over both. He has power over the natural world and the supernatural world. His power is greater. All right? So that's one thing. The second thing is this. The Sabbath is going on. So Jesus goes to the synagogue for the Sabbath. He goes to Peter's house. And then you notice that it says, after the sunset, the people started bringing their sick to Jesus. That's important. That's important. There's rules about the Sabbath. You can only travel so far. Specifically, you can travel to the synagogue and home. That's it. So people are observing the Sabbath. They are observing Sabbath. They know what Jesus is capable of, and they're still observing the Sabbath. Now, I don't know where their hearts are, but they're observing Sabbath rules. And so Jesus receives them after the sun goes down and Sabbath is over, and he heals people. So he responds to obedience. He does. He responds to obedience. Here's the third thing to take out of this passage. This is a great and beautiful picture of evangelism. This is how evangelism should work. This is a culture that, there's no technology, there's no email, there's no text, there's no social media, there's no nothing. But everybody knows in Capernaum. Everybody knows what Jesus is doing. And they're all drawn to him. They all come to him. Right? That's the way evangelism should work, isn't it? Word of mouth. We do it for mechanics. We do it for restaurants. Yelp. Have you ever heard of Yelp? We do that. That's a thing. Why wouldn't we do it? Jesus is infinitely greater than any mechanic. Right? No offense to anyone who's a mechanic. But Jesus is better. If we would do it for a mechanic, why wouldn't we do that for Jesus? Right? That's what happened here, and the whole town of Capernaum comes to Peter's house. Everybody knows. Here's the last takeaway. Jesus is still in control of everything. He has power over the demons. He has power over illness. Jesus is in control. And he doesn't let them speak. He doesn't let the demons speak. Why do you suppose that is? It wasn't time. They knew who he was. And Jesus knew it wasn't the right time for everyone to know. So he says, be quiet. And they're quiet. They're quiet. It's impressive. So word has spread. Everybody in Capernaum, they all know about Jesus. They all know what he's capable of. They may not know his true identity, but they know who he is, and they want more. But Jesus has different plans. Let's see what Jesus' plans are. Verse 35 says this, in the early morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up and left the house and went away to a secluded place. And he was praying there. Simon and his companions searched for him. They found him and said to him, everyone is looking for you. And he said to them, let us go somewhere else, to the towns nearby, so I may preach there also. For that is what I came to do. And he went into their synagogues throughout Galilee, preaching and casting out demons. So Jesus observes the Sabbath. He does his typical practices of the Sabbath. He goes to the synagogue. He teaches. His actions are perfectly in alignment with God's intent for Sabbath, a time of rest. Right? Everything is perfectly aligned. But even with observing the Sabbath, even with the rest that occurs there, Jesus still carves out time to go be alone with his Father. He carves out time to be alone. He carves out time for spiritual rejuvenation, renewal. Jesus is in high demand. Everybody wants a piece of Jesus, right? Everybody wants to, but he says, no, my priority is going to be time with the Father. It's going to be time with the Father. I'm never too busy to spend time with God. He even gives up sleep in order to spend time with God. And I don't know about you, that's a tough one. That's a tough one, right? Any of you like, oh, I get way too much sleep. I could do with a little less sleep. I don't hear that ever. I don't hear that ever. Sleep is precious. But Jesus gives up time sleeping to prioritize time with the Father. That tells you just how important it is, right? And his time with the Father leads to this. Jesus' agenda is the Father's agenda. The Father's agenda is Jesus' agenda. They are perfectly aligned. Not surprising, they are one, right? They are perfectly aligned. So much so that while everybody else wants him to stay in Capernaum, Jesus wants to go. He says, I didn't come here to stay in one town. I came here to preach the word to the people of Capernaum. And they all know. They all came to Peter's house. They all heard the message. I'm done teaching here. I'm going to move on. I'm going to another town to preach. And that's exactly what he does. He leaves town. He walks away. And he goes elsewhere to preach the gospel. Why? Because that was the Father's agenda for him. And he was obedient to the Father's agenda, not man's. He could have been a celebrity. He could have been a rock star. But that's not what he was here for. He moves on so he can tell others, right? So Jesus leaves with his disciples to go throughout the region of Galilee, and more incredible things happen. Let's look at verse 40. And a leper came to Jesus, beseeching him and falling on his knees before him, saying, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Moved with compassion, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I am willing. Be cleansed. Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed, and he sternly warned him. He, Jesus, sternly warned the man. He sent him away and he said, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them. But he went out and began to proclaim it freely and spread the news around, to such an extent that Jesus could no longer publicly enter a city, but stayed out in the unpopulated areas. And they were coming to him from everywhere. Again, evangelism at its finest. Jesus is hiding. Jesus is staying out of cities. But they know where he's at. They know where he's at. They're coming. So there's lots that happens here. It's an amazing story. So leprosy is one of the worst possible things that a first century Jew could experience. It is absolutely terrible. Now, leprosy would have referred to any number of skin conditions, but it's not like we have a whole slew of dermatologists who are going to pick, right? There are criteria for how leprosy is determined, and the priests do it, and if you have leprosy, out you go. You are cast out. You're not allowed to be around people. Ostracized. You're not allowed to touch people. People are not allowed to touch you. So much so that if you're in an area where other people are and you have leprosy, you're supposed to go around shouting, unclean, unclean, so people know to stay away from you. So, to go along with the pain and discomfort of leprosy, there's also the emotional damage of isolation and separation from family. Like, that's a real consequence of leprosy. And here's what I find so beautiful about this story, and it's very much like what happens with Peter's mother-in-law. Jesus doesn't just heal the leprosy. Jesus doesn't just heal the leprosy. He could have stood at a distance and said, ooh, you're healed. But that's not what Jesus does. Jesus also treats the emotional side of this illness. He goes to him and touches him, before he says anything, before he heals him, the first thing he does is touch him. It's probably the first touch this man has experienced in a very long time. Jesus heals the man's leprosy, and he heals his emotional wounds. It's just amazing how completely Jesus heals. Completely. Two big takeaways from this week. Two big takeaways. The first is this: Jesus doesn't see people with problems to solve. He doesn't see people as problems to solve, right? He sees them as people to be loved and cared for. And that's what he does. They have a condition that needs to be cured. And Jesus is all in, right? He is all in. He doesn't just heal their physical damage. He heals every part of them. He casts out demons. He cures not the fever, but he cures the infection. He doesn't cure symptoms. He cures totally, completely, 100%. Jesus doesn't see people as problems to be solved. He sees them as people to be loved. So the question, the takeaway for you is this: is there anybody in your life that you see as a problem to be solved? Is there anybody in your life that you view that way? I'm guilty, right? I'm guilty. Can I just encourage you, whoever that person is, to just take a step back and reevaluate? Look at them through the eyes of Jesus. Look at them through the eyes of Jesus. And don't see them as a problem to be solved. See them as a person to be loved and served and cared for. And then do that. Here's the second takeaway. Jesus demonstrates this perfect balance between work and rest. Between work and rest. Man, that is something that we struggle with as a culture. We struggle so much with it. But Jesus is amazing. He serves and then he recharges. He pours out and then he fills up. That's what Jesus does. You ever feel tired and worn out? Weary? Like, so much, so busy, so tired. Man, I'm guilty of that too. I struggle with that. Have you ever given up time with God to handle the problems of this world? Oof. Yeah, me too. Me too. Can I just encourage you? Stop. I tell myself, I make this mistake. I tell myself, well, I just need to get a little more organized. I just need to be a little more efficient. I just need to get a little bit more rest, and everything will be okay. That's treating the symptoms. That's not curing the problem. Right? Jesus demonstrates this perfect balance between work and rest, between pouring out and filling up. What I would encourage you to do is, if you're weary, if you feel like you're constantly poured out, if you feel like you're spent, take some time and fill up. And the way you do that is alone with the Father, because He is the source of rest. He is the source of rest. If that's where you are today, just choose to make time, to spend time with the Father. And I promise you, you will find rest in Him. If you got a decision to make this morning, I just want to encourage you to do it. Mark would say, do it immediately. I would say there is no time like the present. So I encourage you to come as we sing.